This story will help you drift into a peaceful sleep. Where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and let's drift into peaceful dreams. The clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the desolate mansion. Anna stood at the edge of the grand foyer, staring down the long hallway that led to the cellar door. The house had been empty for years, but tonight, the air felt different, thick with a presence that hadn't been there before. A faint whisper skittered through the shadows, so soft she almost convinced herself it was the wind. But then it came again, closer this time. A cold shiver ran down her spine as her heart began to race. She wasn't alone. Her eyes flicked to the stairwell behind her, but the shadows there were still silent. Anna's breath hitched, and the whisper came once more, unmistakable now. It wasn't the wind. Someone, or something, was calling her name. She turned, but the hallway was empty. She could feel it, though. Something was watching her, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. She swallowed hard, her feet unwilling to move, but she knew she had to face whatever was waiting in the dark. With a trembling hand, Anna reached for the cellar door. The whispers grew louder, as though they were right behind her, urging her forward. Anna. Anna's hand trembled as it brushed against the cold, tarnished doorknob. The whispers were now a chorus, growing in intensity, wrapping around her like invisible chains. She could feel them, each one sliding under her skin, filling her ears with the promise of something terrible, something waiting in the dark. A creak echoed from the floorboards behind her, sharp and deliberate. She spun, heart pounding in her chest. Nothing, just the shadows, long and menacing, stretching unnaturally toward her. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady her racing breath, but the fear in her chest made it nearly impossible to think clearly. She had to leave. She had to get out of the house. But then, the whisper returned. It wasn't just her name anymore. It was a command, a demand. Come closer. The words seemed to come from every direction, swirling in the darkness, pulling her toward the door. She didn't want to listen, didn't want to obey, but her body betrayed her. Slowly, like a puppet on invisible strings, she stepped forward, the cellar door creaking open in response. As the door swung wide, the air turned frigid, biting at her exposed skin. The staircase leading down into the cellar seemed endless, the shadows pooling at its base like a hungry void. Anna hesitated, her eyes darting to the stairs, then back to the hallway behind her. She couldn't go back. The whispers had grown louder, almost deafening now. Come closer, Anna. We've been waiting for you. She shuddered but forced herself to take a step down. The moment her foot touched the first step, the air thickened, pressing against her chest, making it harder to breathe. She blinked rapidly, her vision beginning to blur. Something was wrong. She could feel it deep in her bones. The sound of something scraping across the floor in the cellar echoed up to her, sharp and jagged, like nails on stone. She froze, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear nothing else. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs were frozen, her body unwilling to move. And then a low growl, a sound that made her blood run cold, rumbled from the depths of the cellar. It was almost human, almost, but not quite. It was the sound of something waiting, something hungry. The whispers crescendoed, drowning out her thoughts. Don't stop now, Anna. You've come so far. Come deeper. Her chest tightened. She wasn't sure if it was the pressure of the air, the weight of the unseen force, or the realization that she had already crossed a point of no return. But she knew one thing for certain. There was something down there, something that wanted her. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by a sickening scraping sound, like something being dragged across the stone floor. Her pulse quickened. She didn't want to go any further, but her body moved on its own. Another step down, and then another. Then, just as she was about to take the final step, the lights flickered overhead, flickered once, twice, before plunging the hallway into darkness. A voice, deeper than the whispers, reached her ears. Anna, it's too late to turn back now. The ground beneath her feet groaned. The darkness swallowed her whole. Anna's breath caught in her throat as the cellar door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. She was trapped. The air was thick, suffocating, and it seemed to press down on her with increasing pressure, as if the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. The growl from the depths of the cellar rumbled again, closer this time, a bone-chilling vibration that rattled her bones. She spun around, desperate for some sign of light, but there was nothing, just the darkness and the oppressive silence, thick like a living thing. Anna, the voice, no longer a whisper, was now deep and gravelly, reverberating in her chest. It wasn't just the words that terrified her. It was the way it seemed to come from inside her own mind. You shouldn't have come here. Her heart hammered in her chest, and panic surged through her veins. Her legs were still frozen, her body locked in place by fear. Yet she could feel something moving toward her, slowly, deliberately, like a predator circling its prey. Then something shifted in the dark. A sound, a breath. It wasn't hers. Her head snapped to the left. A shadow moved in the corner, barely visible against the blackness. Her eyes strained, desperate for some detail. But all she could see was the outline of something tall, impossibly thin, and unnatural. It stretched unnaturally, like it was being pulled toward her, drawn by some invisible force. "Who's there?" Anna's voice trembled, barely a whisper. The words felt useless as soon as they left her lips. She already knew the answer. It had been there all along, watching. The thing in the corner shifted again, the shape twisting, distorting as it came closer. The growl grew louder, almost drowning out her thoughts. The stench of decay filled the air, making her gag as she took a shaky step back. A low, raspy laugh filled the room, low and cruel. It was familiar, too familiar. Anna's blood ran cold as the laughter died away, replaced by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, dragging across the stone floor. They were slow, measured, deliberate, like something taking its time to savor the hunt. It was getting closer. "Anna," the voice spoke again, but this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was multiple, layered over each other, echoing in her ears, closing in from all sides. "You've always belonged to us." She forced herself to move, her legs trembling beneath her, but every step felt like wading through thick mud. Her feet barely touched the ground, the weight of the darkness pressing her down, urging her to stop, to surrender. But then, just as she thought she might collapse, her foot caught on something. She stumbled forward, her hands reaching out for anything to steady herself. She collided with something solid, wooden rough. Her fingers brushed over the surface. A door. The relief was fleeting. For the moment her hands gripped the door, the growl came again, closer, unmistakably near. A rancid breath hit the back of her neck, so close she could feel it against her skin. It smelled of rot and something far worse. She didn't dare look. She could hear it, feel it, the thing right behind her, its presence like a weight pressing down on her. The whispers rose again, louder now, filling her mind. "Open the door, Anna. You don't have a choice. Open it, or we'll take you anyway." Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands shaking as she turned the doorknob, praying it would open. It clicked. The door creaked open just enough to slip through. She didn't hesitate. She threw herself through the narrow opening, tumbling into what seemed like another room. But the moment she entered, she knew something was wrong. The walls were closing in. The air was even colder now, biting at her skin, numbing her to the core. And that growl, it was still there, echoing in the space behind her. But this time, it was joined by something worse. The sound of dragging, something long, heavy, scraping against the floor. The door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside once more. And then, in the crushing silence, she heard the words she dreaded most. "We're here." The darkness swallowed her whole. Anna's breath caught in her throat as the cellar door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. She was trapped. The air was thick, suffocating, and it seemed to press down on her with increasing pressure, as if the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. The growl from the depths of the cellar rumbled again, closer this time, a bone-chilling vibration that rattled her bones. She spun around, desperate for some sign of light, but there was nothing, just the darkness and the oppressive silence, thick like a living thing. Anna, the voice, no longer a whisper, was now deep and gravelly, reverberating in her chest. It wasn't just the words that terrified her. It was the way it seemed to come from inside her own mind. You shouldn't have come here. Her heart hammered in her chest, and panic surged through her veins. Her legs were still frozen, her body locked in place by fear. Yet she could feel something moving toward her, slowly, deliberately, like a predator circling its prey. Then something shifted in the dark. A sound, a breath. It wasn't hers. Her head snapped to the left. A shadow moved in the corner, barely visible against the blackness. Her eyes strained, desperate for some detail, but all she could see was the outline of something tall, impossibly thin, and unnatural. It stretched unnaturally, like it was being pulled toward her, drawn by some invisible force. "Who's there?" Anna's voice trembled, barely a whisper. The words felt useless as soon as they left her lips. She already knew the answer. It had been there all along, watching. The thing in the corner shifted again, the shape twisting, distorting as it came closer. The growl grew louder, almost drowning out her thoughts. The stench of decay filled the air, making her gag as she took a shaky step back. A low, raspy laugh filled the room, low and cruel. It was familiar, too familiar. Anna's blood ran cold as the laughter died away, replaced by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, dragging across the stone floor. They were slow, measured, deliberate, like something taking its time to savor the hunt. It was getting closer. "Anna," the voice spoke again, but this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was multiple, layered over each other, echoing in her ears, closing in from all sides. "You've always belonged to us." She forced herself to move, her legs trembling beneath her, but every step felt like wading through thick mud. Her feet barely touched the ground, the weight of the darkness pressing her down, urging her to stop, to surrender. But then, just as she thought she might collapse, her foot caught on something. She stumbled forward, her hands reaching out for anything to steady herself. She collided with something solid, wooden rough. Her fingers brushed over the surface. A door. The relief was fleeting. For the moment her hands gripped the door, the growl came again, closer, unmistakably near. A rancid breath hit the back of her neck, so close she could feel it against her skin. It smelled of rot and something far worse. She didn't dare look. She could hear it, feel it, the thing right behind her, its presence like a weight pressing down on her. The whispers rose again, louder now, filling her mind. "Open the door, Anna. You don't have a choice. Open it, or we'll take you anyway." Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands shaking as she turned the doorknob, praying it would open. It clicked. The door creaked open just enough to slip through. She didn't hesitate. She threw herself through the narrow opening, tumbling into what seemed like another room. But the moment she entered, she knew something was wrong. The walls were closing in. The air was even colder now, biting at her skin, numbing her to the core. And that growl, it was still there, echoing in the space behind her. But this time, it was joined by something worse. The sound of dragging, something long, heavy, scraping against the floor. The door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside once more. And then, in the crushing silence, she heard the words she dreaded most. "We're here." The room was pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt alive, pressing in from all sides. Anna's breath was shallow, ragged, her heart hammering in her chest. She could hear nothing but the low hum of her own pulse in her ears, and the scraping sound behind her, slow and deliberate, growing closer with every passing second. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for a source of light, any sign of something, anything, that could give her a shred of hope. Her fingers brushed against the walls, cold and rough, coated in layers of dust that felt centuries old. Her mind raced, but every thought was drowned out by the growl that reverberated through the room, vibrating the very air around her. "Please," she whispered to herself, but the words felt hollow. No one could hear her. She was alone. The scraping grew louder, closer. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She could feel it now, that undeniable presence, a weight pressing down on her like a storm before it breaks. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were alive, swirling around her, reaching for her. She reached out desperately, her fingers brushing against something cold and hard. A shelf, a table. She couldn't tell. Her eyes were useless in the dark, and the silence between the growls felt like an eternity. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, suffocating her with the stale, cold air that smelled like mildew and decay. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scraping against stone, nails, or claws, grinding along the floor. The noise was deafening, too loud, as if it was coming from within her own skull. Her body went rigid, every muscle screaming for her to move, to escape, but her legs felt like lead, immovable. Then, just as suddenly as the sound had started, it stopped. A deafening silence. Anna's pulse roared in her ears as she held her breath. It felt like the whole room was holding its breath, too. Her eyes darted around, useless in the dark, but she could feel it now. Something was watching her. Something had stopped moving, but it was still there, waiting. Her skin crawled, goosebumps rising along her arms. And then, from the oppressive stillness, a voice, a soft, mocking whisper. "Did you think you could escape?" The words didn't come from any one direction. They seemed to echo from all around her, surrounding her, sinking into her bones. Her heart slammed against her ribcage, the fear rising like bile in her throat. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her chest, strangled by the suffocating darkness. She reached out, trying to find her bearings, her hand brushing against something sharp. She recoiled instantly. A broken shard of glass, jagged and dangerous, resting in the middle of the floor. "Touch it," the voice whispered again, its tone dripping with malice. "It's the only way." Her mind screamed at her to run, but something in the voice, something in the way it sounded, rooted her to the spot. She didn't want to touch it. She didn't want to acknowledge it, but the pull was overwhelming. Every part of her screamed for her to obey, to reach for that shard, to listen. A low hum filled the air now, like an electric current buzzing just beneath her skin. The temperature in the room plummeted, the cold seeping into her bones until she couldn't feel her fingertips anymore. The hum became a vibration, almost like a heartbeat, but not her own. It was something older, something far more ancient. With every passing moment, the room seemed to close in tighter, the shadows thicker, the presence more suffocating. She could feel her own breath turning into fog in front of her face. Whatever was in the darkness was drawing closer, and it wasn't just the sound of claws scraping against the stone anymore. No, it was something heavier, something far more dangerous. She could hear it now, moving behind her, slow and deliberate. And then, she felt it, a hand, cold as ice, brush lightly against her shoulder. The room exploded with a burst of movement, the shadows lunging forward. A cold breath, like something out of a nightmare, filled her ear. Too late. And then, the world went dark. The darkness pressed in on Anna, suffocating, drowning her. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the sensation that washed over her. Cold fingers like ice against her skin, a weight of unseen eyes boring into her from every direction. Her body refused to move, frozen in place, as if the darkness had gripped her limbs in its invisible jaws. She blinked rapidly, but the blackness remained impenetrable. Her heart thundered in her chest, and her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. She couldn't see, couldn't hear anything except the deafening pulse of her own fear. Yet, deep within her, she knew it wasn't truly silent. The shadows were whispering again, not soft like before, but urgent, hissing words that curled around her like smoke. "You've come too far, Anna. You belong to us now." The voice was low, guttural, almost a growl, but it wasn't one voice. It was many, layered over each other, distorted, filling the void around her with the unmistakable sound of something ancient, something that had waited for years to find her. Her breath hitched, She could feel it now, the presence that had been waiting. It wasn't just behind her. It was all around her, surrounding her, suffocating her. She could almost feel the walls closing in, pressing against her from all sides, pushing her into a corner with no way out. A sudden thud echoed in the distance, a heavy, unnatural sound, as if something large had fallen or was being dragged. It was far away, yet it sounded like it was right next to her, reverberating in her bones. And then, a noise, a dragging, wet sound closer now, unmistakable. Anna tried to move, but her feet were stuck, as if the ground beneath her had turned to quicksand. Her legs trembled. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her body refused to obey. Anna, the voice whispered, this time directly in her ear, so close she could feel the breath on her skin. You cannot escape. You're already ours. The ground beneath her feet groaned, and with a sudden jolt, the floor seemed to shift, tilting violently. She stumbled, falling forward, her hands desperately reaching out to catch herself. But there was nothing solid to hold on to. Her fingers brushed against something cold and smooth, like glass or stone, and before she could make sense of it, the room lurched again, throwing her off balance. She fell hard, hitting the ground with a sickening thud, and the world seemed to blur around her. The moment her body hit the floor, she felt it, the cold presence closing in, the ground beneath her trembling as if something enormous was stirring beneath the earth. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, more frantic. It was as if whatever had been waiting was growing impatient, anxious to claim her. She forced herself to stand, her body aching, her limbs heavy, like she was moving through molasses. She had to move. She had to get out, but the air was thick, pressing against her chest, making it harder to breathe. Another thud, closer this time. Anna, the voice was everywhere now, surrounding her, filling her mind with its chilling promise. Her heart was in her throat as she forced herself to move again, stumbling forward, her feet scraping against the rough floor. But each step felt heavier than the last. The whispers were growing louder, more frantic, urging her forward into the blackness, pushing her towards something she couldn't see, but could feel, something cold, something alive. Then, as if from nowhere, a faint light flickered in the distance, far off in the shadows. It was weak at first, barely noticeable, but it grew brighter, and with it, the ground seemed to tremble once more, the room vibrating with an unnatural force. Anna's breath caught. The light. It wasn't a natural light. It was flickering erratically, like a flame struggling to stay lit. And then, through the growing haze, she saw it. A shape, a figure standing in the center of the light. Tall, shadowed, its features obscured by the dim glow. It didn't move, but Anna could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed upon her. She hesitated. Her body screamed at her to turn away, to run in the opposite direction, but the light drew her in. It felt like it was pulling her, tugging at her very soul. And then the whispers, the voices, they all came together, filling the space around her. Come closer. The words slithered into her mind, curling around her thoughts, making her chest tighten with fear and anticipation. She couldn't see what lay ahead, but she knew. She knew it was something far worse than the dark, far worse than whatever had been chasing her. She couldn't stop herself, one foot in front of the other, moving closer. The scraping grew louder again, like something massive, something ancient, dragging itself closer. The light flickered once more, casting strange, twisted shadows on the walls. Shadows that seemed to move, contorting unnaturally, as if they were alive. Anna's heart pounded in her chest as she took another step, and then the ground beneath her feet trembled once more. A violent jolt that nearly sent her crashing to the floor, and for a brief moment, the flickering light flickered out completely. And then, in the blackness, the growl came again, closer. It was no longer a distant sound. It was right there, right behind her. The growl reverberated through the very air around her, a deep, guttural sound that clawed at her insides. Anna froze, her heart hammering in her chest as the darkness seemed to press even tighter around her. She dared not move. She could feel it, the weight of something unseen, something ancient, looming just behind her. Her breath came in short, frantic bursts, each one louder than the last. The coldness in the air intensified, biting into her skin as though it were trying to freeze her in place. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, clenching and unclenching at her sides as if they could somehow grasp onto the air, onto something solid, something that could give her a way out. But there was nothing, no escape. The scraping sound returned, louder now, and much closer. It was a jagged, relentless noise, like claws digging into the stone floor. She could feel it, feel the movement behind her, hear the slow drag of something massive approaching. Her eyes darted frantically in every direction, seeking any sign of light, any sign of a way out. But the darkness pressed in from all sides, and the weight of the unseen presence behind her grew heavier. Her legs shook, threatening to give out beneath her, but she forced herself to take one step forward, then another. She stumbled forward, the ground beneath her feet uneven, each step a battle to keep herself upright. But as she moved, the growling grew louder, sharper. It was right behind her now, so close she could feel the breath on her neck. Her pulse quickened, her throat tightening as the air grew thicker, colder. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then, in a sudden burst, the light returned. It flickered weakly at first, casting twisted shadows that danced along the walls like living things. For a moment, it was enough for Anna to catch a glimpse of what lay ahead. It was a door, a heavy, rusted door at the far end of the room, barely visible in the weak light. The door looked ancient, old beyond measure, its surface covered in strange markings, symbols she couldn't decipher. But it was a door, a way out. Without thinking, she surged forward, her hands outstretched, desperate for the safety it promised. But as she neared it, the air seemed to thicken again, heavier, thicker than before. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping, filling her ears with cold promises. "Don't open it, Anna." The voice was familiar now, too familiar. It was the same voice she had heard earlier, the same voice that had been with her since she stepped into this cursed house. But now it was more insistent, more commanding. "Turn around. We are not finished with you." The cold fingers of dread wrapped around her heart as she slowed, her hand hovering just inches from the door. Something wasn't right. She could feel it. The light, flickering in and out, cast strange shadows in the corners of the room, shadows that seemed to move, to shift, to form shapes too grotesque to imagine. And then the scraping sound came again, right behind her, louder than ever. It wasn't claws anymore. It was the sound of something dragging itself across the floor, heavy and deliberate, a wet, disgusting sound that seemed to vibrate the air itself. Her chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at her to open the door, to escape, to leave this nightmare behind. But the voice, no, the thing was right. Something inside her told her not to open it. Not yet. Not until she understood what was happening. The scraping came closer. Too close. She spun, her heart in her throat, her eyes darting through the shifting shadows. But she saw nothing. There was nothing there. The darkness had become all-encompassing, suffocating. And then, the light flickered out once more. The growl was right behind her, so close it vibrated in her very bones. Anna spun around, her pulse thundering in her ears, and in the blackness, she saw it, a shape, towering, massive, standing just beyond the reach of the dim light. It had no face, no features. It was a shifting, monstrous silhouette, but Anna could feel its gaze. It was watching her, waiting. Too late. The voice rasped, now a chorus of many. "You are ours." Her breath caught in her throat. She felt a cold, icy hand press against her chest, like something pulling her in, suffocating her. She couldn't move. Her legs wouldn't obey. And the presence, no, the thing, was closing in. A twisted, dry laugh echoed around her, filling the room, reverberating in her skull. The scraping sound resumed, this time all around her, like something moving through the darkness, closing in from every direction. Anna's chest tightened with panic. She had no choice. She had to act. With trembling hands, she grabbed the handle of the door and twisted, praying, hoping. against everything that this would be the escape she so desperately needed. The door creaked open, and the moment it did, a wave of cold, oppressive air flooded the room. She could feel it pulling her in, and she had no choice but to step forward. But as soon as she did, the door slammed shut behind her, and the growl, louder than ever, filled the air. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. Anna stumbled forward into the unknown, her feet unsteady, her head spinning. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash, and she flinched at the sound, but she didn't dare look back. The air around her was thick with an oppressive, unnatural cold. Her breath misted in front of her, and the walls of the narrow corridor seemed to close in with every step she took. The whispering voices returned, louder now, surrounding her from all directions. It was like they were coming from inside her mind, each one layered on top of the other, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. The words were fragmented, broken, and yet they made her blood run cold. Too late, you cannot escape. You belong to us. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she pressed forward, her mind racing, each step taking her further away from the fleeting light of the room she'd just left. She didn't know what she was running from. No, that wasn't it. She knew what she was running from. The question was, could she outrun it? The corridor ahead of her stretched on, endless and winding. The flickering light she had seen earlier was now gone, replaced by a dull, sickly glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The light flickered in and out, casting grotesque shadows that danced along the edges, warping and twisting in ways that made her stomach churn. She could feel them, the eyes of something watching her from the darkness, something that had never left, something that had always been here. Suddenly, a sharp noise, like a snap, pierced the silence. It was so sudden, so unexpected, that Anna gasped, her body tensing in terror. She whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat, but saw nothing, just the oppressive blackness, stretching endlessly behind her. But then the air shifted, and she could feel it, a change. Something was moving, something was closer. Her breath caught in her throat as the sound of something dragging, heavy and wet, returned. It was slow at first, distant, but it was coming for her. The thing that had been behind her, waiting, was now on the move, and it was gaining ground. Anna ran. She pushed herself forward faster, her feet pounding against the floor as she tried to distance herself from the scraping sound, the low growl that had become a constant, oppressive presence in her mind. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every step, the corridor narrowing, squeezing her from both sides. She could feel the pulse of something in the walls, a dark, malevolent energy that was feeding off her fear, growing stronger with each frantic footfall. She didn't dare look back. She knew if she did, she wouldn't be able to stop. The thing was behind her, and it was relentless. Another snap echoed in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps. They were closing in on her now. Too fast, too heavy. A dark shape appeared at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the flickering light. It was tall, unnaturally so, its outline indistinct but looming, shifting in and out of the shadows, like a nightmare taking shape. Anna's breath caught in her chest, and for a moment, she couldn't move. She was frozen in place, her body screaming to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. And then it stepped forward. The figure was tall and thin, almost skeletal, its limbs stretching unnaturally long. Its face, if you could call it that, was a mask of pure darkness, smooth and featureless, like a void in the shape of a man. Anna couldn't see its eyes, but she could feel them. She could feel its gaze, cold and predatory, crawling across her skin like 1,000 tiny fingers. She gasped for air, her lungs burning, and in that moment, she realized with a sickening certainty that she wasn't alone anymore. The hallway had become a trap, and she was the prey. The growl, the scraping, the shuffling footsteps, they were all coming from the same thing. The darkness had taken shape, and it was coming for her. Anna didn't think. She just moved. She turned and ran, her breath ragged in her throat as her legs pumped faster, her feet pounding against the cold, stone floor. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every step, the air growing colder, heavier. The whispers rose again, louder, filling her head with a cacophony of distorted voices. "You cannot escape. Not this time. Come closer." The words seemed to seep into her skin, digging deep, pulling her toward the darkness. She could feel the weight of it, pressing on her chest, suffocating her with its invisible grip. Her heart raced, the pulse in her ears deafening, and yet the thing behind her was still there, dragging itself closer with every breath. Another snap, closer now. Too close. She pushed harder, her body screaming in protest, her mind filled with a single, desperate thought. Escape. A door. She saw it, at the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim, flickering light. It was old, weathered, and covered in strange symbols. It didn't matter. It was her only chance. With every ounce of strength, she surged forward, her hands outstretched, reaching for the handle. But just as her fingers brushed against the cold metal, the growl erupted again, louder this time, shaking the very walls around her. The dragging sound was all around her now, closing in from all sides, and in that instant, she knew she wasn't fast enough. Something cold, sharp, and unforgiving gripped her ankle, yanking her off balance. Her scream was cut off by the deafening silence that followed. Anna's scream shattered the silence, but it was swallowed up by the oppressive darkness that enveloped her. The icy grip around her ankle tightened, pulling her back with unrelenting force. Her hands scrambled against the floor, her nails scraping against the cold stone, but she couldn't find purchase. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was working against her, dragging her deeper into whatever nightmare had taken hold of this place. Her heart raced in her chest, and her breath came in short, ragged gasps. She twisted and turned, kicking her legs in a desperate attempt to free herself, but the grip only grew stronger. It was pulling her into the shadows, deeper into the suffocating blackness, where she couldn't see, couldn't escape. Her mind raced. She couldn't think clearly. The whispers filled her head, swirling together in a maddening chorus, each voice more insistent than the last. "Come closer. You're not leaving. You belong here." Anna's eyes widened in panic as the shadows around her seemed to shift, growing darker, more oppressive. She could feel the coldness seeping into her very bones, draining the strength from her body. The thing behind her, she could feel it now, its presence looming over her, just out of sight. It was waiting, savoring her fear. She kicked harder, the soles of her shoes scraping against the stone, but it wasn't enough. The cold fingers tightened further, pulling her toward the center of the hallway, where the light barely flickered, barely held on. Suddenly, the grip released. For a moment, Anna thought she had escaped, but before she could react, a bone-chilling scream echoed through the corridor, so loud it shook the walls. It wasn't her voice. It wasn't anything human. The air vibrated with the sound, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift again, tilting as if the entire building were coming alive, twisting around her. The walls groaned and creaked, and the ceiling above her trembled as if it was about to collapse. Anna scrambled to her feet, barely able to catch her breath as the whispers became a frenzied chant, overlapping and warping into a single word that reverberated through the air. Escape. She didn't know if it was a command or a warning, but the word echoed in her mind, driving her forward. She had no choice but to keep moving. She looked back once, just once, to see what had been chasing her, but all she saw was a flash of dark movement, a shadow that slithered across the hallway, too quick to catch. It was there, but it was gone before she could even make sense of it. Her legs shook with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she could feel whatever had been lurking in the dark closing in again. The door. It was still there, just ahead, its symbols glowing faintly as if inviting her closer. But with each step she took, the space between her and the door seemed to stretch further. The walls seemed to close in around her, the floor beneath her feet buckling, as if the entire building were trying to pull her back. She reached for the handle again, her fingers brushing it, but as soon as her hand made contact, a loud, deafening crash echoed through the corridor. followed by the unmistakable sound of something large and heavy crashing to the ground behind her. Anna whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. The hallway was filled with a thick, choking fog that seemed to appear out of nowhere, swallowing everything in its path. She could barely see her hand in front of her face, and then, from within the fog, she heard it, a low, gravelly voice, so close it made her skin crawl. "You can't escape. You never could." Anna's pulse surged, and she threw herself at the door with all her remaining strength. The handle turned under her grip, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. It was as if the entire world had conspired to keep her trapped here, in this hellish nightmare. Her breath quickened, her mind racing. The whispers were louder now, more frantic, urging her forward, urging her to unlock the door, to step through it. But she couldn't move fast enough. The fog thickened, and with it, the presence that had been lurking in the darkness grew stronger. She could feel it all around her now, a weight pressing against her chest, smothering her. The ground beneath her trembled once again, and a cold, sharp pain shot through her chest, as if invisible hands were tightening their grip on her heart. She gasped, stumbling backward. The door was still there, still just within her reach, but she was trapped. The growling returned, louder than ever, vibrating through the very walls around her. It was closing in, drawing nearer with every passing second. Her head swam, her vision blurred. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Everything inside her screamed for her to run, but her body refused to obey. She felt herself sinking, pulled into the dark, into the cold, into the suffocating presence that threatened to swallow her whole. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she heard a new sound, a voice. Not a whisper, not the growl, but a voice clear, sharp, and undeniably familiar. Anna. She turned, her heart skipping a beat, and in the distance, through the fog, she saw a figure. It was him, the man she had been searching for, the one who had disappeared all those months ago. He stood at the far end of the corridor, bathed in the faint, flickering light, his silhouette barely visible in the haze. He was looking directly at her, his expression unreadable. "Help me," she whispered, but the words barely left her lips. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching her. And then the fog thickened again. The growl returned, and Anna realized she wasn't the only one being hunted. Anna's heart pounded in her chest as she locked eyes with the figure at the end of the corridor. His face, obscured by the fog, held an unsettling stillness. For a moment, she thought she saw him take a step forward, but the fog shifted, swallowing the movement before it could register. The growl from behind her grew louder, deeper, its source impossible to pinpoint, but unmistakably closer. She reached out, her hand trembling, as if reaching for him might somehow pull her out of the nightmare. "Please," she breathed, her voice barely more than a whisper, drowned by the deafening sound of her heartbeat. "Help me." But the figure didn't respond. He remained motionless, a shadow in the mist. And then something shifted in his stance. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and pointed directly at her. A chill ran down her spine. He wasn't warning her. He wasn't calling for her. His eyes, those eyes that should have been comforting, held a darkness, an emptiness, that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. The fog closed in even tighter, curling around her legs like tendrils of smoke, squeezing, choking. She gasped for air, her chest constricting. The growl behind her was now a monstrous rumble, vibrating through the very bones of the building. Whatever had been hunting her was no longer behind her. It was everywhere, closing in from all sides. She could feel its breath on the back of her neck, feel the weight of its presence pressing down on her like an invisible hand. The figure's lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. "Don't you see?" he murmured, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, colder than the fog around her. "It's too late to leave. This place, it owns you now." Her heart stopped. The room seemed to spin around her, the walls contracting, the ground shifting beneath her feet. Her breath came in frantic bursts, her pulse erratic as she tried to move, tried to make sense of what was happening. The figure, was he speaking the truth? Was there no escape? With a forceful lunge, she pushed herself toward the door, her legs buckling under her. The sound of her footsteps seemed to vanish into the fog, her every movement swallowed up by the oppressive weight of the air. She reached for the handle again, desperately, pulling with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if the door itself had become part of the darkness, its edges melting into the walls, becoming one with the fog. Her breath hitched as the ground beneath her feet shifted once more. Someone was coming. She could feel it, like the air was charged with static, buzzing with tension. The figure at the end of the hall stepped forward, his smile stretching wider now, as though enjoying her fear. "You're not meant to leave," he whispered again, his voice a low rasp. "None of you are." Anna's stomach churned with dread, and she stumbled backward, but the movement seemed sluggish, as though the air itself had thickened. The fog closed in further, wrapping around her like a suffocating cocoon. The growl behind her was deafening now, shaking the walls, the very ground beneath her feet. She knew what was coming, knew it in her bones. A sound erupted, something wet, something tearing. The air grew colder. The darkness that had been creeping toward her now filled every corner, every crevice of the hallway. The figure raised his hand again, but this time, it wasn't a warning. It was a command. She could hear the scraping sound now, not distant, not behind her, but directly beneath her feet, drawing closer with every passing second. Something was moving, something massive, its movement slow but deliberate, dragging itself through the fog. She turned and saw nothing but darkness, an abyss that seemed to stretch forever. The scraping continued, but now it was joined by the unmistakable sound of something wet slithering across the floor, dragging itself, something much larger than her, closing the distance at a terrifying speed. Anna turned again, her heart racing, her legs burning from the effort to run, but the fog seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the hallway curving into infinity. There was no escape. There was nowhere to go. "Don't fight it," the figure's voice echoed from behind her, his words slipping into her mind, cold and sharp. "It's already too late." She looked down at the floor and saw the dark, oily tendrils of something moving beneath the stone, creeping toward her like a living thing. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world around her spun faster, and the ground seemed to drop away. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a stench so putrid it nearly made her gag. Then, in a flash of horrifying clarity, she saw it, a shape no longer hidden in the shadows, moving through the fog, a grotesque form, hulking and twisted, its eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. Its mouth was open, dripping with something black, its teeth jagged and broken, its body covered in strange, pulsating scars. It was massive, it was monstrous, and it was coming for her. Her heart stopped, then raced into overdrive as she turned and ran, not caring where she was going, not caring about anything but putting as much distance between her and the thing behind her as possible. Her hands reached out blindly, but the walls seemed to shift, to close in, making every path seem the wrong one. The thing was closing in on her with terrifying speed, its growl now a deafening roar, shaking the very foundation of the building. But the door was still there. She could see it now, just a few steps ahead, the symbols on its surface glowing faintly. She had to reach it. She had to escape. The thing was too close now. She could feel its breath on the back of her neck. She lunged for the handle, her fingers slipping over the cold metal, but it wouldn't open. And then, just when she thought it would end, the figure at the end of the corridor stepped forward once more, his smile widening impossibly, his eyes now glowing with an unholy light. "You should have listened," he said softly, his voice full of cold satisfaction. "You belong to it now." Anna's breath came in jagged bursts as she reached for the door again, desperation clawing at her chest. Her fingers brushed the handle, slick with sweat, but it didn't move. The thing behind her was almost upon her now, its growl vibrating through the air, making the walls shake. Every part of her screamed to escape, but the door would not open. The figure at the end of the hall, he just stood there, a silent observer, watching her with that same chilling, knowing smile. His eyes burned, not with any human warmth, but with something colder, something ancient, like the abyss staring back at her. "You can't outrun this," he said, his voice low, cruel. "There's no escape. You should have listened when you had the chance." The growl behind her intensified, and the floor beneath her feet began to tremble. Anna turned, frantic now, heart racing as she looked for another way out. Her mind was a blur, every escape route a dead end, every turn a path leading to nothing but deeper shadows. The thing was nearly on her. She could hear it now, its massive body dragging across the floor, slithering and scraping like a serpent with scales of steel, its grotesque shape pushed through the fog. An enormous mass of twisted limbs and blackened flesh, eyes glowing with malice. It reached for her. Anna's chest tightened as a cold, clawed hand grazed her shoulder. She felt the sharp sting of its touch, like fire and ice combined, piercing through her skin. She gasped in pain, but there was no time to focus on the pain. She had to get away. She had to find a way out. But the more she struggled, the more she realized that there was nowhere to run. Every corner, every hallway, every door led her back into the same suffocating darkness. The building had become a labyrinth, and the thing chasing her was its predator, its hunter. And then, as the thing's hand closed around her arm, she felt it, its presence deep within her mind, its will weaving itself into her thoughts like a dark vine, wrapping around her soul. It whispered to her, its voice low and serpentine. "You can't fight me. You never could. You've always belonged to this place. You always will." Anna's blood ran cold as the fog grew heavier, pressing in on her chest. She could feel it now, the truth clawing its way to the surface, the shadows, the whispers, the presence. It wasn't just chasing her. It had been inside her all along, feeding on her fear, waiting for this moment when she was weak enough, desperate enough, to realize that she could never escape. Her legs buckled beneath her as the weight of it settled deep in her bones. She gasped for air, but the walls seemed to close in tighter, the fog growing thicker until she couldn't see anything beyond the darkness wrapping around her. The figure at the end of the hall stepped forward again, and this time, his eyes, those burning, hollow eyes, locked onto hers. The smile stretched wider, almost in mockery. "You were never meant to survive," he said, his voice resonating deep within her, as though it was coming from inside her skull. "You are part of this place now, part of the darkness." Anna's pulse hammered in her ears as she tried to move, tried to break free from the thing that held her, but it was no use. She was sinking, drowning in the suffocating darkness, every breath an effort, every movement an impossibility. But then, in the deepest part of her mind, she heard something else, a voice familiar, desperate, calling her name. "Anna." It was a whisper at first, soft, as though carried on the wind. But as it grew louder, the air around her seemed to shift. The oppressive weight of the fog lightened, and she felt a strange tug in her chest, as though something, someone, was pulling her away from the thing that held her. Her heart stuttered, hope flaring briefly. It couldn't be. But the voice, that familiar voice, continued. "Anna, it's not too late. You can fight it. You have to fight." She tried to focus, to force her mind back into clarity. She couldn't remember the last time she'd heard that voice. But she knew it. She knew it. And in that fleeting moment of clarity, the shadows around her flickered, just for a second, revealing a figure, someone standing just beyond the fog, barely visible, but real. The figure from before, the man who had disappeared. Her breath hitched, and for a brief instant, she thought she saw him reach for her, his hand stretching toward her, but the shadows pulled him back, as though the darkness was determined to keep her from him. "Anna," the voice cried again, desperate now. "You have to fight." The grip on her arm tightened, and the thing behind her growled, dragging her back into the fog. The figure in the distance faded, his voice barely audible now, lost in the depths of the encroaching darkness. The growl of the creature was deafening, rattling her bones, and she felt herself slipping into something cold, something endless. With her final breath, Anna screamed, the sound raw, primal, louder than the growl, louder than the whispers. And as the darkness closed in around her, She realized the horrible truth. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for her soul. Anna's scream echoed through the suffocating fog, her voice rising above the growl, above the whispers that clawed at her mind. Her chest heaved, but each breath felt more shallow than the last, as if the very air was being stolen from her. The thing that had been hunting her, this monstrous presence, was too close now. She could feel its rancid breath on her skin, its claws sinking deeper into her flesh with every heartbeat. The figure, the man who had been her only hope, her only tether to the world outside the nightmare, was gone now, swallowed up by the shadows. His voice, his face, all of it fading into the endless abyss, leaving her with nothing but the oppressive weight of darkness and dread. The floor trembled beneath her feet as the thing's growl reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the building. The walls seemed to close in, the stone bending and twisting, as if the building itself were alive, a living entity that hungered for her soul. She struggled to breathe, her legs heavy, her body aching from the exertion, but she couldn't stop moving. She couldn't stop now. There was no time. Every inch of the dark hallway was closing in, and the only thing she could feel was the creature's presence, its weight pressing down on her, pulling her deeper into the fog. But then, suddenly, the world tilted. The walls around her groaned, creaking as if they were coming apart. A sharp, sickening crack split the air, and for a moment, the fog lifted, just enough for Anna to see the shape of it. The thing, the creature that had been hunting her. It was massive, its form barely contained by the confines of the hallway, its grotesque body writhing and twitching like something unnatural, something born of nightmares. It was a monstrosity, its limbs long and twisted, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, malevolent light. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a contorted, grotesque mask of skin and bone, its jagged teeth glistening in the dim light. And it was coming for her. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. It was all too much. The terror, the pain, the sense of impending doom. It was suffocating. She felt herself falling into the depths of fear, spiraling downward, unable to escape. And then, just as the creature lunged, as its massive hand reached for her, something inside Anna snapped. A surge of energy, raw, primal, furious, burst from the deepest parts of her. It was as if the very core of her being had awakened, ignited by the terror, by the despair. The darkness that had been choking her, suffocating her, was suddenly pushed back, if only for a brief moment. The fog thinned, the oppressive weight lifted just enough for her to breathe. She stumbled forward, her body moving on pure instinct. She didn't know how she was doing it, but her legs carried her faster than they ever had before. Her heart was pounding in her chest, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she could feel it, feel the power inside her, the connection to something greater, something that had been there all along. It wasn't just the darkness trying to consume her. It was something else, something she had never fully understood. The creature roared behind her, a deafening sound that threatened to tear her apart. She could hear it gaining on her, its steps shaking the ground beneath her, but she didn't dare look back. She couldn't. Not now. Ahead of her, the door was still there, just beyond her reach. The faint symbols on its surface pulsed, as though alive, glowing with an eerie, beckoning light. Her hand reached for the handle again, fingers slick with sweat, her pulse racing. She tugged at it, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but it wouldn't open. The door was locked, just as it had been before, just as it always was. And then, in that moment of desperate helplessness, she heard the voice again. Anna. It was him, the figure, the man who had vanished, who had left her with nothing but the darkness. But this time, his voice wasn't distant. It wasn't fading. It was here, inside her mind, clear as day. Look at me. Listen. Anna's hands trembled, her entire body shaking from the strain, the fear, the terror that gnawed at her insides. She didn't want to listen. She didn't want to understand. She just wanted out. She wanted it to end. But something, some part of her, forced her to turn, forced her to look into the fog. And there, standing just outside the edge of the dim light, was the figure again. His eyes, those glowing, empty eyes, locked onto hers, a silent command in their depths. His expression was unreadable, but she felt it. The weight of his gaze, the pull of his presence. "You can escape," he said, his voice calm, like an anchor in the storm. "But you must make a choice." Anna's breath caught in her throat. A choice? What choice? What could she possibly choose now? The creature behind her was nearly on her. The walls were closing in again. There was no time for choices. There was no time to think. But then, the figure spoke again, his words slicing through her panic like a blade. "You have the power to change this, to break free." Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked at him, trying to process his words, trying to understand. But the fog had returned, heavier than ever, and the creature was nearly upon her. She could feel its claws scraping against the floor, feel its monstrous presence wrapping around her like a vice. The figure's expression remained unchanged, his eyes still burning with that eerie light. "Choose, Anna. You have the strength to end this, to stop it. But you must let go of everything you know." Let go of everything. What did that mean? Let go of what? She couldn't. She couldn't even comprehend what he was saying. And then, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble again, more violently this time. The walls groaned, the air thickened, and the growl of the creature grew louder, closer. "Choose," he said once more, his voice growing urgent, but still calm. "Choose now." Anna's mind raced, her body screaming with the instinct to run, to flee. But the creature was already upon her. The door was locked. The figure was fading back into the mist. And the choice. She didn't know if she could make it. Anna's body shook as the weight of the creature's presence pressed in on her. Every breath felt like an eternity, every second slipping away like sand in an hourglass. Her mind raced, torn between the creature's relentless pursuit and the figure's cryptic words. She could feel the claws of the thing nearing, hear the rasp of its breath as it slithered closer. But in the depths of her panic, there was a clarity. Something was different now. Let go of everything you know. The words echoed in her mind, a whisper carried on the fog. She didn't understand, but somehow, deep down, she knew that the key to escaping the nightmare was hidden in that very message. Let go. She took a deep breath, the fog thickening around her. Her hands were trembling as she closed her eyes, letting go of the fear, of the desperation, of the need to run. She let go of the horror that had been chasing her, of the pain, of the hopelessness that had gripped her soul. And just like that, the fog began to clear. The darkness lifted, fading into nothingness. The weight that had been pressing on her chest vanished, and the growling sound that had filled her ears was replaced by an eerie, peaceful silence. She opened her eyes. The hallway, the fog, the creature, they were all gone. The world around her had changed, shifting into something new. The figure was still there, but now, he looked different. His smile had softened, his eyes no longer glowing with an otherworldly light. He was no longer the harbinger of doom, but something else, something guiding, something safe. "You did it," he said, his voice now warm, comforting. "You chose." Anna's heart swelled with a strange, unexplainable sense of relief. She had done it. She had broken free. The nightmare was over. The thing that had haunted her was no more, and she was no longer trapped in that endless cycle of fear. But she wasn't alone. She wasn't lost. The figure, now appearing as a calm, guiding presence, stepped forward, his expression kind. "You're free now," he said, "and you can leave whenever you're ready. The darkness will never hold you again." Anna stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The fog had lifted, and the world around her was bathed in soft, golden light. The walls were no longer closing in. The air was fresh, clear. She was free. With a smile, she turned and stepped into the light, leaving the darkness behind her. And as the last remnants of the nightmare faded away, the figure's voice lingered in her mind, a reminder of the strength she had found within herself. "Remember," he said, "the darkness can never control you again." As Anna walked away from the nightmare, the world ahead of her felt full of possibilities, full of hope. Thank you for joining us on this thrilling journey. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe, like, and follow us for more chilling tales, exciting adventures, and gripping mysteries. We'll be back with more to keep you on the edge of your seat.